Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Anne Arundel County Public Schools 2018 Tuesday Summer Series. In an effort to address and provide information on topics of concern to residents across the county, Anne Arundel County Public Schools is hosting 6 summer series sessions, and tonight is the second. Our session will end no later than 7:00 p.m. Please be advised that the session is being recorded and will be posted on the website for public reference. Note cards have been provided for you to write down questions pertaining to this evening's topic. Questions will be reviewed and read by our moderator, Dr. Maureen McMahon, and read in the order in which they are received. Throughout the presentation this evening, you may complete a card and give it to Dr. McMahon. Only questions on the note card will be acknowledged, and one question per card, please. Personnel and private issues can be discussed with our staff at the conclusion of this meeting. This evening's topic is an overview of our Student Code of Conduct. Our Director of Safe and Orderly Schools, Ms. Alice Swift, will provide an overview of the code. The Office of Safe and Orderly will be co-facilitators in this conversation as well. Ms. Swift will introduce her team when she arrives. The department is under the supervision of Assistant Superintendent for Student Support Services, Ms. Sally Egan, who is also here with us this evening and will be available during the question and answer session. At this time, I would like to introduce Ms. Alice Swift. Thank you, Ms. Swift.
Thank you. And good evening, and thank you. This is an awesome privilege and honor to come out this evening to speak with our parents and our constituents and students about our code of conduct, to give you an overview of how it all comes together. And before we do that, I'd like to introduce my team. It's part of the team, but those that could make it this evening is Dr. Sean Ashworth, Special Assistant, Program Specialist. We have Mr. Wade Blair, who's one of our special assistants, and of course Dr. Lauren Ward-Allen, who is also a special assistant. And so there are, as I said, there are other members of the team, but were not able to make it this evening. And as folks come in, hopefully it'll be more, but it's a nice intimate group. So please, I'm going to walk you through the overview, and then that'll probably free up more time for us to have some conversation for you all to ask the questions that you'd like to have answered this evening. So at this time, we'll begin our PowerPoint presentation. And as always, in any PD, we have outcomes. And tonight's conversation will address topics and concerns and key issues that you may have. We will do our best to answer any related questions that you have. And of course, to increase your understanding of the Student Code of Conduct. That will be the ultimate outcome as you exit this evening. The materials that you picked up when you came in, of course, we have it in English and Spanish. It's the Student Code of Conduct. There are two sides. The side we're focusing on is the actual student handbook. The other side is for parents. And also there are copies of the brochures for our Charles Legion programs. And so on each of the PowerPoint slides, there's conversation regarding page numbers. So you can reference the code, and you can keep those materials and put your notes in there as you know, I take you through what we're going to talk about this evening. But page 1 of the code is your table of conduct. Table of contents, which outlines student rights and responsibilities, student discipline, where parents and students can go to get help with a problem, of course, resources that are accessible to our parent community and our students, and the glossary of terms that support our actual code of conduct. The page 2 outlines our Board of Education policies and administrative regulations, and they are documented there on the PowerPoint. And they're also located in your student handbook, or the Code of Student Conduct. And some of those administrative regulations and policies speak to teaching about religion, religion in schools, opening patriotic exercises, academic dishonesty, homeless students and compulsory attendance, of course, student rights and responsibilities, student conduct, student organizations, student suspension and expulsion, student records, student attire and personal appearance, care of school property by students, and of course, student complaints related to policy, regulation, or law. Interventions, that conversation begins on pages 6 through 9. And when we talk about interventions, we're looking at our universal, targeted, and individual things that schools must do to change student behaviors. We all have a general expectation that when students do report to school that they're doing everything right, and that they're adhering to the basic rules of the school and going to class on time, having materials and things like that. And of course, at times when there are students who then become in that narrow, corridor that become that targeted child, that we have to do a little more. There's a continuum of proven activities and supports and programs that we have outlined in the book, and some things aren't in the book. And then that individual student that we really must focus on, of course, then it becomes a little more intense, where we want to make every effort to support them through their educational processes, and also having interventions that are aimed at reducing those continued and or behaviors that could possibly escalate into very serious violations under the Code of Conduct. The consequences and levels of discipline, and this is a tricky area, or an area where parents may say, well, what does that mean? Or, how does this particular violation fall at a level 3, 4, or 5? Or what would constitute a 1 or 2? And we can talk about that at the conclusion of the presentation if you have specific questions, that we could gear some examples to clarify that for you. But our level 1 and 2, of course, over time, there's specific violations that are automatic level 4s, automatic level 5s, and we will address that. And of course, the consequences that fall in that continuum, they would be for more serious violations that begin at a higher level. And of course, any student that commits a violation under the Code of Student Conduct could be subject to being charged, or receive a citation and or arrested, could be arrested on school property, in addition to being disciplined through the Code of Conduct. And one other thing I do want to add would speak to restitution, for example, for destruction of property or loss of damage of school property. That family could be, and most likely would be charged with that financial obligation. Suspensions and expulsions. There are tiers in terms of the progressive. Some are automatic, but over time the goal is to reduce the level of exclusion. So I'll start with the lowest possible type of exclusion as it relates to student discipline, and that would be your in-school suspension. And that would be an exclusion within the school, no more than 10 days, but 1 to 10 days in-school suspension, and not at one time. It could happen incrementally. Short-term suspension would be 1 to 3 days out of school. A long-term suspension is 4 to 10 days out of school. And 1 to 10 in total, short and long, principal can make the decision to remove a child. Anything above that, 11 on up to 45, you're now in your more serious level 4 or 5 range. That would be considered an extended suspension. The superintendent now is involved with making a decision, and or his designee. And in that case, that will be myself or Sally Egan to my right, after review of the case by the special assistant and us looking at the evidence that supports the removal. But we'll talk about that as we move along. And then, of course, the expulsion, that would be a removal of a student for a minimum of 45 days, and it could be a maximum of the balance of the school year. You may say, well, what constitutes an expulsion? Well, a handgun, loaded or unloaded on school property, would constitute an expulsion from school. And so the final one would speak to bus suspensions, and that's progressive because it's levels 1 through 4, students' first offense, second, third, fourth offense, and students with disabilities, if transportation is built into their IEP and they're unable to get to school, then that would count as a suspension day or days, and then there would have to be other arrangements made for that child to get to school. But a bus suspension does not mean the student is suspended from school, just they're suspended from the bus. The appeal rights in anything. If parents don't agree with the decision of the principal through the short and long-term suspension process, Then, of course, on the day that the child is suspended from school or excluded, the parent may appeal that decision to the regional assistant superintendent by putting either an email or a letter in writing to the principal, and the regional assistant superintendent would review all actions and investigation that led up to that particular decision and render a decision either to uphold the suspension of the principal or to say the child comes back. The extended suspension and or expulsion, that falls into the office that I represent, the Office of Safe and Orderly Schools. And so once we render a decision on behalf of the superintendent, the parent does have the right to appeal 10 days from the date of the letter when you receive that. And then the school system must, and you appeal, to the Board of Education. And then the school system has to respond within 30 to 45 days, and that matter is handled with an outside hearing official. And that would be for the extended suspension or expulsion, any days from 11 to 45 and or 45 and beyond for that expulsion request. Getting help with the problem. And I think that that should be like the whole focus before we always tell or give the gray area first. But a lot of times when we find that students are excluded, they may have had difficulty communicating their concerns with the adults in the building, whether it be the teacher or their grade level administrator or counselor. But the main thing is if your child or students that you know of that are friends to your friends or people in your community say, our goal in building these relationships and continuing to foster what we know about the expectation to have all children in school should be our 100% priority, is that we implore to you all to say, please exercise, your rights if you feel that your child is being bullied, cyberbullied, intimidated, harassed, sexually harassed, if they've experienced issues of bias-motivated behavior or hazing. And that's in any venue that is sponsored through Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Please know that anything that your child brings to the table with regards to getting that help is confidential and should be held in the strictest of confidence to whomever they're talking to, speaking with. That any school problems, personal problems, academic problems that they're having, and of course extracurricular and their activities. A lot of times sponsors, after school engage with our children, and of course, things happen on sports teams, and there's some words exchanged, and then it may spill over into the classroom. But we need to say to you that it is important that you know that we are here to support and help. But the first stop in the road before students take matters into their own hands is to identify where to get that help. And that's outlined on pages 24 and 25 of the student handbook. And then the last document, or I believe slide, would speak to the acknowledgement of review. What I've just said in a nutshell should be coming to parents at the start of school, back to school nights, in PTSA meetings, in grade level assemblies, amongst student government organizations, that this conversation should be throughout on PA announcements so that our students understand that in the event that they do violate the code and there are consequences to that, that you know that you're signing off on what it is that Anne Arundel County Public Schools and our Board of Education has set forth to govern those processes. And it's a contract, basically. And so the goal in the acknowledgement of the code, which is on the front page of the actual booklet and will be updated for 2018-19, speaks to conversation around participation in senior activities. A lot of students decide to do pranks at the end of the year, and they can lose their privileges. Academic integrity, of course, technology resource and use by students, and the biggest and probably one of the most heavy hitters is our bullying, cyberbullying, intimidation, harassment, hazing, and bias-motivated behavior, actions of which students do violate consistently. And so when you review this, when your child brings this home in the fall, you're acknowledging that you've gone through the code and that you've expressed to them, hey, this is what can happen. And if your child is awesome, as I'm sure they are, and they are advising their peers, they should be telling them too that this is what binds the agreement between the school system and our families. And of course, investigations do take place, and we do try to render the best decision based on the information that we do have. But that document is critical, and it should be signed after review and returned back to the school. It's put on file, and hopefully never to be looked at and used again. But in the event that it has to be pulled during our due process of accountability, this document would be pulled to see if, in fact, parent and student did sign and if they understood why the student was receiving the consequences that they are getting for the violations that they may allegedly do. Okay, so. If I could, before Ms. Jackson comes back up, we were asked to introduce the team, and I'd like to introduce Mrs. Delmar Washington. She is the coordinator of our Charles Leisure programs, and we'll talk about those as we segue into the next set. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Swift. At this point, I know that some of you may have questions. If you would pass them to Dr. McMahon, again, we ask that you put one question per note card if you do have a question, and please put your contact information on the back so that if we do have follow-up, we can certainly follow up with you. We're going to begin. Dr. McMahon does have some questions already. If you do have that way, we'll give you a minute or two. Please feel free to listen. You don't have to ask a question. We know that some of you are here as community members trying to get some more information. Remember, school-specific or student-specific information will not be answered during the course of this presentation because it is public information, and it will be remain on the website for public and to protect privacy of our students. We will have a time to answer those after the session has ended. Additionally, a question will be asked by Dr. McMahon. Our team will respond, and if there's a follow-up question, you can certainly follow up with the team afterwards, but it's not an opportunity for back and forth conversation. Thank you so much. Dr. McMahon?
Thank you, Mrs. Jackson. Ms. Swift, the members of the team, the first question is, can you talk a little bit about the different ways students have the opportunity to learn about the code of conduct in the school building, both at the elementary and middle and high school level?
All right. Well, the elementary, middle, and high, we have our student code of conduct lessons. They were developed partially by Dr. Sean Ashworth and students in the PVA program, of course, the Office of School Performance, and also ways would be through the public address system, grade level assemblies, back to school night, PTSA meetings, of course, our student leaders. You know, it just depends on the school and the principal and their team and how they do it. They have initiatives in the school. They may want to tackle anti-bullying or something like that. They may want to tackle bias. They may want to promote activities and extracurricular things and talk about the rights and responsibilities for the privileges that students do receive. But the creativity, there is no one fit systemic way. But I do want to acknowledge that high schools and middle schools really, get on board to promote a lot of creative ways that kids get involved to promote the code. But those are some of them. I didn't know if anyone else knew of any other. Go ahead.
I was going to add to.
You have to come to the mic because they want to record.
For our elementary students, last year the code of conduct lessons were embedded into the daily curriculum, and so they'll see that as teachers are reviewing daily curriculum, the code of conduct lessons are embedded in I care statements, which follows the elementary curriculum themes.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about how often the code of conduct is reviewed or modified?
Okay. It is a process annual that we start, I would say, Sally, about March, April, but more April. It's a 3-meeting or 3-tiered process, and it involves every office at central office, from parents, students, technology, security, special ed, legal, safe and orderly, curriculum and instruction, student support services. I mean, every office in this building touches the code of conduct. And we divide it out into the 11 domains that it rests with. We assign team members, and of course they provide their input, and then we vet it through legal. We also rely upon the recommendations from the Maryland State Department of Education. We look at data points as they support the changes to the code. For example, one of them this year will be threats of mass violence, where we have bomb threat already in the code. We have Category 4 attacks or threats at a lower level, although we, are very clear all threats are serious. But threats of mass violence is new based on what is happening across this country, students losing their lives or, through gun violence, and just trying to get a handle on it to be more proactive instead of reactionary in the event that things happen in schools.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
This is one a little bit different. Could you please explain how the dress code and personal appearance guidelines are developed regarding both genders?
Well, we say both genders, and we even have included transgender
Yes.
or students that are in transition, because there's some students that that are of that sex who like to wear the opposite sex clothes, and then there's some students that are transitioning to another gender.
Yes.
So in terms of specific, the hats, the shoes, for safety precautions, in terms of the development of that, data through risk management, incidents of students getting hurt by certain paraphernalia or drugs or, anything that is offensive to a particular group or organization or protected class, they're not allowed to exhibit that in their attire. And those particular codes of enforcement come through the actual school-based administration, whether hats are allowed, when they walk through the building, the shorties of shorts, or, certain things, midriffs, and anything that's exposing body parts or drawing attention and causing a disruption to the school, then of course the adherence to following, would come through the administration. But in terms of the development, it falls in line with all of the other violations potential that could exist. And so we gauge it that way. Like Heelys, I'm thinking about some new things that came down the pike, but our standard gang-like activity, drugs, anything that's defaming a particular group of people and their rights and privileges to be in school, and if it's on that person's, body through their clothes, they should be pulled in, and that should be addressed immediately.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you talk a little bit in your presentation about the level of consequences
Yes.
for infractions. Are the level of those consequences mandated by COMAR, or are they set by Anne Arundel County Public Schools?
Yes, thank you. The State Department of Education gives autonomy to the local superintendent to impose those particular consequences. But again, it's based on data points. We do get recommendations, but the school system and per COMAR, we are allowed to modify it to meet the needs of what we're seeing, the trends, the data. It could be attacks and fights. Do we need to up a level? Should it have started at a level 1? Does it need to go to a level 3? Should a student be suspended first time fight, or can they be mediated and brought in for a conversation? And we always would look to try to mitigate it that way. That would be our hope as the Office of Safe and Orderly Schools and our message to our school leaders. But ultimately, they're in the school, they're dealing with the particular situation, and they make the decision based and judgment based on what's happening in that moment. But in terms of where it comes from, the state sets the guidelines. We're required to review our data sets, and then from there, we have that same collaborative discussion with that team that comprises of the Student Code of Conduct Committee. And then, of course, we make decisions, and those decisions are always vetted to the assistant superintendent, our deputies, and, of course, the superintendent himself.
Thank you.
Yes.
This question's about biased behavior.
Yes.
Does bias pertain to student versus student and or student to staff?
Bias pertains to all, student to student and student to staff, and staff to staff. And so our office doesn't touch staff to staff. We deal with student to student incidents. The Office of Investigations, the Employee Case Management through Human Resources, our deputies, they handle that particular discussion if it's adult bias. But all means all. We are inclusive. We support every student, and so when we hear about it, of course, the goal would be that they be referred to the bias-motivated course. And if parents aren't able, because we always put this disclaimer out, to get there, then we do allow for other accommodations such as outside counseling and support, outside mentoring and support, outside clergy support, to help change the ideals that people either have seen, experienced, have heard, so that they come in an environment and put their personal thoughts about people to the side, and that we navigate through and respect everybody regardless of what they bring to the table.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Maureen.
So this person asks, how do I report, and to whom do I report a problem like bullying or a bias-motivated incident?
Thank you.
And that's based on whether I'm a parent, a staff member, or a community member.
Sure, and that's an excellent question, because that seems to be the biggest thing. There are two ways. The bullying report forms, hard copy, one in the Code of Conduct or the Student Handbook. In addition, our preferred way is the electronic way. And so when you go onto our website, www.aacps.org, and you click on the drop-down menu, you will see the stop sign for bullying, anti-bullying. You click that. It's a 2-page form, and you complete that online. As soon as you hit submit, it SharePoints directly to me, to the principal of the school, to the regional assistant superintendent over the school, and of course the assistants that help us with our work. So, and of course the assistant superintendent over the Office of School Performance, they also get a copy, their office. And so what happens after the report comes in, the school within 24, no more than 48 hours should be responding to that parent family, either by calling, asking the parent to come in, getting the overview of the report, meeting with the impacted student and alleged victim, and start an investigation based upon what it is that the student has brought forward. Once that occurs, the due process for the student that's been accused now, they are now able to be called in, and should be. They are asked about the allegations that have been brought forth, and then the school must make a decision whether it is a bullying, intimidation, harassment, hazing, or bias, particular incident. Sometimes, the first time, according to the state, bullying has to be a repeated act. So the initial time it happens, if it happens again, unfortunately, and a lot of times it does, then the school can escalate it up and document it as bullying. Sometimes it's intimidation. Sometimes it is harassment. And we also want to not leave out cyberbullying. We do not want to leave out sexual harassment, and we do not want to leave out harassment. And all of those terms are identified on page 27 and throughout the end of our code on the student handbook side that help you to navigate and to understand what those terms actually mean. So when you say it's bullying, okay, yes, as parents, that's probably what we would say. But you would need to know the outcomes of the investigation as it relates to, a generalization of what the school's findings are. And then from there, they would, share with you what they can. They're not able to tell you about the discipline of the other child. And then, of course, if other things need to be done, meaning changing classes, meaning separate students, safety plans, and things like that, all of that would come into play. But the actual reporting mechanism that we prefer is the electronic way. But there is a hard copy there. If you don't have a computer, the administrator at the school should be assisting your child. The guidance counselor, if they go there privately and safe and secure to do that amongst that person only. Again, when I emphasize confidentiality, that is paramount. We don't want any, retaliation to anyone that comes forward to report. And you can also call the hotline, and the numbers are identified, I believe, in the front section of the book under the table of contents. It's right in the front. It probably doesn't even have a page number on it. And those numbers will stay consistent. And if you all see that, I'll reference it for them. But I hope that helps. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So this kind of extends that same question. Mm-hmm. Can you describe the restorative practices that we use now in the schools, the positive restorative practices that many of the schools have begun to use?
Sure. Many of the schools have begun to use the restorative practices. I know that if you want to go into the specifics, but I'll do the generalization of it. Sometimes conflicts can be mitigated through that circle. If there is a dispute or back and forth and students come together, and the group can be as small as 2 and as large as 10 plus. But with that being said, I know that there are essential questions that are asked of the students. It's a talk talking about more or less an introspective approach and how that student can look at what their role was in terms of how they got to where they did. And through that process of restoration, of people owning what they did, now what can I do to be better, and how can we walk away? They don't have to leave being friends, but they can agree to disagree and respect each other's space. And I don't know, because I know Dr. Ashworth has had a lot of training in that as well, and I didn't know if she wanted to go into specifics on that.
Good evening.
Dr. Ashworth, I'm wondering if you could start with community circles.
That's exactly where I was going to start.
Thank you.
I was going to start with many of our schools, if not all by now, actually begin the idea of restorative practices through community circles that happen in the mornings or during advisory times. In elementary, we call them community building circles. In our middle school, secondary schools, some schools are calling them morning rallies. And it is there as an opportunity for students to get along, to learn how to get along, to have positive conversation and relationships. There usually is a question of the day, and that question usually relates to a school rule, maybe something in the code of conduct or something happening in the building, or just, again, how do we talk nice to each other. And so that's where every school is adopting that concept. And then as we get more into some deeper structures of restorative practices, those usually take place. Sometimes the school counselors use them as a way to prevent. There might be word of a he say, she say, or a guy to guy problem that's going on, and the school counselor or administrator will call what we call a restorative circle, and we bring those individuals together. And really the purpose of the circle is to heal harm, right? It's to really look at what the potential aggressor is doing and the impact that their behavior is having, not only on them academically, socially, but also on the school and at home and to the parent. And so restorative circles are done to heal harm and to make better decisions. And then we also have what we call community conferencing. And community conferencing comes into play as we get more serious in behavior. So say there's a fight between two individuals. Again, our goal in Anne Arundel County is to keep kids in school and also to create a safe environment. And so a third party will come out to the school once they are contacted to perform what we call a community conferencing. And that conference involves both families. So it's not just the students, but are the parents or the grandparents, whoever's involved. And again, it's an opportunity to heal the harm that is done. At the end of that community conference, there is a contract that is done between the school and the parents and that student on maintaining appropriate behavior as outlined in the code of conduct.
Thank you very much.
If I could add just on the community conference component, that's the Family Partnership Office for Anne Arundel County. Vince Taylor is our point of contact for that. And the last thing I want to add about that is it's almost an unwritten contract between families that if there are other things that happen in the community, that Vince Taylor's office would have the right to move the matter to the Department of Juvenile Services. So when we talk about community conferencing versus restorative practices or circles, that's a little more serious for students that just won't stop, students that are reporting to neighborhoods that they don't belong in, students who are really causing problems that we have to get another agency in to say, hey, we had a conversation, this is what the agreement was, but out of that agreement, we have some unsafe situations still going on, and now we have to report these matters to the local authority. So that's the other catch-all that parents would need to know, and they are told that at the onset of those conferences because it could escalate into something a little more serious if they don't take heed to what they agreed to. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this question, again, is about biased behavior.
Yes.
The writer says, sexual harassment is listed as one of our biased behaviors. It feels as if a student must be sexually harassed more than once before it's escalated to an administrator for opportunity to engage.
Sure.
Is this the case?
I would say no, it's not the case. And I would say no. I'm speaking for the superintendent. I'm speaking for my supervisors here and the assistant superintendents and, of course, our deputy. When we talk about all rights should be protected at all times. It's not a one-time, two-time that a student should be allowed to sexually harass anybody. And if that is occurring, as Ms. Jackson stated, we would probably need to know what school so that we can follow up and bring correction to that conversation. I do want to say that bias and sexual harassment kind of tread down the path together, but they're not the same. All right. We deal with protected classes as we speak to a woman's rights or male's rights or LGBT rights. And people need to know, too, that sexual harassment is not just male to female or female to male. It could be male to male, female to female. And so that there's more to come on that. But with that being said, the minute that that person feels that they have been harassed sexually, it should be reported on the bully, intimidation, harassment form. The school within the 24, no more than 48 hours should be responsive, and investigation should begin, and a resolution should come as a result of that. And that could be from anything from touch in the chest area, the buttocks, and of course our private front, area, leg, thigh, foot, anything that they feel uncomfortable with. And not just the unwanted touching, it'd be the assault, which could tread in that area, but the verbal harassment or a written harassment or a picture. Somebody could sketch something or draw something on the desk and point to that to the student to offend. But we want to get the message out to our parents that are here that one time, two times is too many times. So the first time it happens, we need to be responsive to our families.
And that report can come from the student or the parent?
To the student or the parent. And if the student tells a friend and the friend tells the administration, for example, then the administration will then double back to the original source, but the person that reported would become a witness and they would provide their statement, but they have to go back to the source. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So this stakeholder rights, out of school and in-school suspensions have been shown to correlate with a school-to-prison pipeline in some instances. What is Anne Arundel County Public Schools doing to mitigate the negative impact on students who are given in-school or out-of-school suspensions?
Wow, that's a heavy one, because without data points, to say who went, we do know that a lot of times when we start with a short term, could end up long-term extended suspension, but then the child also violates something in the community. There's a community offense, and then out of that community offense, the judicial system may detain that student. But an initial suspension, unless it's, I want to say a handgun, and they bring that to school, that student would be arrested at school, charged, and detained. Okay, so if that is the immediacy of a prison to pipeline, then I have to say then in that case that would be. But the goal of the school system is to provide interventions. If you remember at the onset of the presentation, we talked about what's universal for all. Then we begin to close in on targeted and then that individual student. That individual student may be coming in with barriers of homelessness, barriers of brokenness in terms of divorce and or death, separation. There could be some mental health concerns with that child. But whatever's going on, the goal with our district is to be proactive, to put more student service support in play, get our counselors involved, our pupil personnel workers involved, conduct a functional behavior assessment, take them through a process for the IEPA or 504. Is it medicinal related? It could be any of those things, but it should be responsive to what that particular child needs. However, students do come in, and now I have to come back and kind of route it the other way with regards to Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Sometimes we can't control certain things. And so when we talk about school to prison pipeline, sometimes the kids come in with deficits or a mindset that could potentially be criminal and bring that to the school. But then we still work with outside agencies to get that support. Do they need mentorship? the Boys and Girls Club, recreational activities, resources. Do they need extra help academically or a job? I mean, something that would support them so that when they're not with us and we can't supervise and protect them, that they know that when they come back, just keep coming back, that we're going to be here, but we need for you to hold on. And in your holding on outside of the schoolhouse, we're able to support them through other avenues that keep them off the streets or keep them from making those types of decisions, unfortunately.
And Ms. Swift, can you talk a little bit about our movement from more towards an in-school suspension, away from an out-of-school suspension?
Oh, definitely. The goal, it may not be in-school suspension, but in-school intervention, the decision-making room, the learning lab, depending on what level the child is for elementary, middle, or high, and then what best suits that particular situation. I also want to say sometimes certain violations, as we mentioned in the PowerPoint, would be automatic level 4 or 5, but your 1 and 2, your insubordination, your disrespect, leaving class, cutting class, that's when we're talking more along the lines of that intervention component. But if you're going to fight, attack, bring drugs and alcohol, distribute, possess, use, and do all those things, now we're teetering in another area that we want to try to incorporate our Charles Leisure programs, our ATUP, alcohol, tobacco, and of course our alcohol and drug program.
Do you want to take a few minutes to talk about them?
Sure.
That would be great.
Right, there are 4 of them, and you all have the brochures. I want to say, in Delmar, you can say yes, no. Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday, right? We offer the classes, Phoenix and Marley, middle. Okay, and they start from 4. No, that's right. I'm supposed to be recording. 4 to 8. Okay, and so the first one I'll talk about the bias motivated program. And this is upon investigation that the student made a statement that offended a particular person. Now, the student who was offended might not see it as such. And let me say this just in an example. If 2 students of the same race are calling each other a certain name and people think that that's appropriate, but they hear that and they say, no, that's not appropriate, and they go and tell, and so then that kid can land in the bias, all right? But then the 2 students may say, hey, we call each other that all the time. It's bias, okay? And I don't want to go into case specifics because I don't want to offend anybody.
But is that decision made at the school level?
At the school level. Thank you, Maureen. That's the first one. And it's all protected classes. The second speaks to our responsible action program. And last year we incorporated, I would say, referring students to this who were investigated and documented as repeated bullying, intimidation, harassment, because we recognized there was something inherently wrong in addition to just the action, but they needed to go through the curriculum to finally get it. But a lot of students are also referred to the responsible action program who are upset and angry, who want to cause conflict, don't know how to manage conflict. And so that's what this course speaks to. And the brochure gives an outline of how families get in there and what that anti-tobacco use program, and these are students who use tobacco products, smoking on campus, vapes, Juuls, all of that stuff. We've added that to the code this year because students have gotten very creative with using tobacco products, as has the, who handled the smoking? I don't want to say Food and Drug Administration, but the bottom line is that the products they have are really pretty and really nice looking, and a lot of times teachers may think it's just air freshener, but they could be vaping right there in class. But once known about, they're referred. And there's a tiered process in all of this as well, because we recognize some kids have tobacco addictions. And so then we kind of have to move away. Is it more discipline, or is it now more intervention and support? Some kids have drug problems. Is it more addiction, or do they need support? But that student that's coming and bringing drugs to school and selling drugs to our youth, now we have another problem. But if they are individually addicted to drugs, this is another arena of where we want to assist our kids.
And what is that program called?
Alternative to Drugs. Yes.
Okay. And are all of those programs that you speak of, Ms. Swift, are they programs that are options for an administrator to give as a consequence, or are they offered to the student and their parents or guardians?
Options and given as a consequence. But for what we do, when we have a case that involves, say, for example, a student that bought drugs to school and made attempts to sell the drugs, possession, use, and or distribution. This would be a line item that parent would receive that I hate to use the word mandatory, but as close to mandatory as we can get. Again, we can't make anyone do anything. However, if in fact the parents had cessation classes outside, if they were going to drug and alcohol counseling, we would use that in lieu of this to offset it. It's not a disclaimer. However, most kids that are referred to these programs do attend and they do get better, and we don't see them again. So we're happy about that, the recidivism.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we don't expel many students from Anne Arundel County Public Schools, and I know we're very proud of that.
Yes, that's right.
But when a student is given a consequence of expulsion, what happens to that student during the appeal process?
Oh, well, for our district, and I want to say that Anne Arundel County is a model for the state, one of them, I would say the model. What happens in any removal, we provide a free, appropriate public education to all students. So students who have been expelled are placed on home teaching, and they receive academic support and any other things that they need. If we're talking about students with disabilities, then we work with them. But we do not throw children away. And then upon return, we have a readmission review board. We bring them back through. We want to hear from them. What did you do? How did this change your life? What would you do to be better if we were to, quote unquote, let you back in, i.e. comprehensive school or alternative school? But it is a process. I want to say per the 1994 Gun-Free Schools Act that was signed by President Clinton post-Columbine, that was when the federal government mandated that an automatic expulsion in schools would be for that handgun. Loaded or unloaded. So that's a mandatory per the State Department of Education as well, and or the code under the Code of Maryland regs. So that's an automatic expulsion.
Anything about look-alike guns or toy guns?
Look-alikes are in there too. We look at intent, but that wouldn't be an expellable. It would be an extended suspension, 11 to 45 days. But we do look at intent for that. Okay. Yes.
This one has to do with racial incidents of bias.
Sure.
When there are racial incidents of bias that involve large groups of students or potentially more than one or two students at a time,
Yes.
what happens dealing with groups of students in a school?
Well, when we talk about groups, we always look at the end game. But in any investigation, we have to look at what the root causes are. The catalyst, where did it begin? And each student that's involved, identified, and investigated has a story to tell. So the goal of the administration would be to speak with every student identified and let them lead them to the outcome. So each person's role for whatever happened and how they collided, they would be dealt with as an individual, not as a group. But a lot of times when it finally hits, if you will, and people get wind of it, they believe that it was the entire group that made the contribution to whatever the outcomes were, whether it be riotous, whether there's some graffiti, whether small groups are getting together and pitting against each other based on what they believe to be the elite of whatever. But at the end of the day would be to dispel that, bring folks together, talk about inclusion, support each other, and agree to disagree, but you can't be unsafe in a school. But ultimately, we would hope that the schools do investigate, drill down to find the catalyst of where it started and deal with that student. Each student, of course, deal with all students, but to see what role. And then there's some students whose role might be greater than others. Me standing by while something's going on is different than me actually being involved and actually participating through my words and my deeds, which could be particularly unfortunate in any given circumstance. So.
If we have an incident like any of these that you name in a school,
yes.
How does the parent community find out about an incident, and are there certain ways to find out
Sure.
that are used by AACPs?
Other than the evening news or the news, but we do have an Office of Communications that works in tangent with our schools, our assistant superintendents, our deputies, and our superintendent. And so what happens, there's a coordinated effort to get the facts as we best know them at that time, to calm the community, send out letters, There could be a Connect Ed message. There could be an email that's sent. There could be a parent forum such as this, but of a larger detail. Members of our Board of Education taking a stand and writing a letter to our families of zero tolerance. Our superintendent the same. We've seen that over the course, and of course allowing parents to come to board meetings and get on the billet and get their 2 minutes to say what they need to say, and being adequately addressed and respected for feeling like they were disrespected. But there are multiple ways that we get it out, but the main source has to be vetted through the superintendent and the Office of Communications to get it to our parents.
Thank you very much.
You're
I want to
welcome.
thank you, Ms. Swift,
Oh,
and
you're welcome.
and your
You're
committee
welcome.
for presenting
Thank
tonight.
you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. McMahon, for moderating that, and again, for Ms. Swift and your entire team. I've had the pleasure of working with Ms. Egan, Ms. Swift, and this amazing team. And, Ms. Swift mentioned several times that we are the model, and it's a lot because of the hard work of this team. And I have the pleasure to work with you, Al, and thank you so much. I want to reiterate a few things that Ms. Swift and her team said. So again, thank you. That one of the most important things, if you can carry away from this tonight, again, Ms. Swift gave you the purpose is to talk about this Code of Student Conduct and to give you an overview of some of the programs. But, she talked about the form and the electronic form. But please, if you have a problem, please make sure that you get to the nearest trusted adult at the school. If you're a parent or if you're a student. So, the forms do help. Many people ask the question, as Ms. Swift says, what is the accountability level here at central office? And that the forms really help with that balance between the school and our central office and making sure that we're accountable to our community, but to the most important people, which are our students. Another reminder, even if you think that if you're reporting something and it doesn't necessarily nicely fit into a definition like bullying, harassing, teasing, report it anyway. It's your duty. Make sure that you report it. Even if you're a bystander, if it didn't necessarily happen to you, make sure that you report it, because remember, we're a school system of teaching and learning, and we want to teach appropriate and sometimes replacement behaviors. And so even if it's not considered bullying or harassment, but it's an inappropriate behavior, we still want to hold that student accountable and teach replacement behaviors. The next thing I want to make sure that everyone, I'd like to reiterate to everyone here this evening, is that if you have a clarifying question, or some of you may have something personal, or as Ms. Swift so eloquently put earlier, that something may have occurred in the school that you feel like wasn't necessarily resolved, you can certainly bring that to our attention this evening, and our staff that were here will either provide resolution or get your information to someone that can help provide that resolution. Because of our programming constraints, we have to end the formal part of this program now. I really thank all of you all for coming this evening. Please join us next Tuesday, July the 24th, when our Office of Student Support Services, again under the leadership of Ms. Egan, will present an overview of some of the emotional and social supports that we offer to our students and, in turn, our families here in Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Thank you, and have a safe evening.
Benefits last year, you must complete a new application each school year. Thank you for this opportunity